The village of Grimholt sat at the very edge of the known world, pressed against the foot of mountains so old and so cold that the people living in their shadow had long since stopped giving them names. Names implied familiarity. These mountains had never been familiar. They rose out of the tree line like the knuckles of some buried giant, their peaks lost in permanent cloud, their passes carrying nothing in winter but wind and silence and whatever moved through the darkness between the two. It was deep winter now. It was always deep winter here. Gandalf arrived at Grimholt on foot, his gray cloak pulled tight against a cold that had genuine malice in it. The road from the south had taken him 3 days longer than expected. The last 2 of those days he had walked through snowfall heavy enough to swallow the path entirely, navigating by the shape of the land and by something older than maps. A pull, faint but persistent, like a thread drawn taut between his chest and whatever waited to the north. He had felt such things before. He had learned, over centuries of wandering, that such feelings were not imagination. They were warnings dressed as instinct. The village appeared out of the storm like a rumor of warmth. 15 buildings clustered around a central square where a fire burned in an iron cradle on a stone plinth. The fire was the first thing anyone saw approaching from the south. In a place this far north, a fire in the open square was the difference between hope and the absence of it. He walked through the gate and straight to the hall. Inside, the room was low-ceilinged and warm and full of the particular silence of people who have been frightened for long enough that fear has become their ordinary condition. 20 men and women sat at long tables, speaking in voices pitched low, the way people speak when they are no longer sure who or what might be listening outside the walls. Children sat near the hearth with the solemn expressions of children who have absorbed too much adult terror without the vocabulary to name it. Gandalf took a seat near the fire, accepted a bowl of something hot, and spent the first part of the evening listening. What he heard was this. 6 weeks ago, the Harrow farmstead, the northernmost settlement in the region, a 3-generation family compound 6 hours' walk above Grimholt, had gone silent. No smoke, no signal. 2 men went up to check and came back before dark, which told everything about what they had found, because the round trip should have taken 12 hours. They came back pale, and one of them was sick at the gate before he could get inside. The Harrow family had not fled. They had not been taken in any conventional sense. They were still there, every one of them, exactly where they had been standing when something had happened to them. Encased in ice. Not the rough ice of rivers and cold weather, but something finer, clearer, almost transparent. Ice that had formed from the inside out, as though the cold had entered through the skin and worked its way outward. Their expressions were not expressions of pain. They were the expressions of people interrupted mid-moment. A woman at a hearth, a man lifting a tool, a child turning to look at something just out of frame, preserved in the precise instant before whatever it was resolved into something recognizable. After that, 3 more farmsteads had gone the same way. Grimholt had pulled its people in from the outlying farms, closed its gate, kept its fire burning, and waited. The waiting had not made anyone feel safer. It had only made the fear more practiced. When the main telling was done, Gandalf asked a single question. "What manner of tracks did your men find on the road to the Harrow farm?" The headman, a broad-faced man named Aldrich, looked at him sharply. He described the tracks with the reluctant precision of someone who would prefer not to be thinking about them at all. Large, larger than any wolf or bear, but too light for their size, too evenly spaced, moving in straight lines, like something that knew exactly where it was going and had no interest in anything that was not its destination. Not one set of tracks, but many, sometimes dozens, moving together, moving apart, like a patrol. "They came within half a mile of the gate," Aldrich said, 3 nights ago. From the far end of the table, an old man spoke. Genuinely old, his face so deeply lined it was difficult to read his expression, his pale eyes steady and deliberate. His name was Edric, and he had been waiting for the right moment since Gandalf walked in. "You want to know what leaves those tracks?" Edric said. "The old people of this region called them the Pale Hunters, Snowkin, orcs by blood and nature, but not the mountain orcs or the forest orcs of the south. These are something older. They have not moved in living memory because the thing that commands them has not moved in living memory." "And now it moves," Gandalf said. "Now it moves." Gandalf set down his cup. "Tell me about the Ivory Crown." The silence that followed was different from the previous silences. This one had recognition in it. Edric told it the way the very old tell very old stories, not in a straight line but in layers, circling the center slowly before finally going down. Long before Grimholt, long before any settlement in this part of the north, there had been a kingdom, not vast by southern measure, but true, old and proud and rooted in the northern rock, its people hard and spare and unimpressed by anything that did not help them survive. The kings of this kingdom were guided by something the old songs called the Ivory Crown. Not a crown of metal or jewel, a living creature, a moose white as new snow, with antlers so enormous and so complexly branched that they looked less like the natural growth of an animal and more like a crown worn by something that understood, in a way no human craftsman ever quite had, what crowns were supposed to mean. Ancient beyond reasonable reckoning, larger than any moose had a right to be, walking the roads of the kingdom as though it had made them. The legend held that the Ivory Crown had walked with the first king when he came north to establish his people in that cold and difficult land, that it stood witness at every coronation, not as a tamed thing, but as a representative of the land itself, which in that place was considered more binding than any oath sworn to any god. When the Ivory Crown appeared at the Midwinter Festival, the kingdom had the blessing of the North. When it did not appear, it meant something had broken. The last king crowned without the Ivory Crown, Edric said, was a prince who called himself the Prince of Winter. The songs don't record his given name, only that title which he chose for himself. He came to the throne by ways the old stories are careful not to specify, and the Ivory Crown did not come to his coronation, was not seen in the kingdom for 3 years. And then the cold came, the stopping cold, the same cold that took the Harrow family. He looked at his hands on the table. The kingdom has been silent ever since. We thought it would stay silent. Nothing stays silent forever, Gandalf said quietly. He did not sleep much that night. He lay in a narrow room, listening to the wind find every gap in the timbers, and thought about cold kingdoms and ancient creatures and the particular kind of evil that has convinced itself it is performing an act of preservation. Before dawn he was dressed and at the door. The village square was empty, the central fire reduced to coals throwing dim red light across the packed snow. He stood in the cold for a moment, breathing slowly, getting his bearings. Then something moved at the edge of his vision, and he turned. On the ridge above the northern stockade wall, just visible against the pre-dawn sky, stood a shape of such size and stillness that for a moment his mind refused to properly assemble it. White against white, enormous, distinguished from the snow around it only by the impossible architecture of its antlers. Vast and branching, rising above the creature's head like a crown that no human hand had made and no human head could have carried. It stood with the absolute stillness of something that has spent centuries learning how to be patient. Its eyes caught the coal light from the square and held it. The Ivory Crown. For a long moment neither of them moved. Then, slowly and with unmistakable deliberateness, the great moose turned its head to the north, held that position for 3 long breaths, then turned and walked away from the ridge, disappearing into the snowfall beyond the wall without a sound, silently, impossibly. the way very old things move when they have somewhere to be and have long since stopped being in any hurry about it. Gandalf stood in the square looking at the place where it had been. He went back inside, gathered his pack, left a coin on the table, and was at the gate when the first gray light arrived. The young guard in the watchtower looked down at him with an expression balanced between duty and bewilderment. "You're leaving? Now?" "Yes," Gandalf said. "Where?" Gandalf looked north, at the ridge where the snow held the last faint impressions of enormous hooves, already softening in the new wind. "North," he said. The gate opened. He walked through it. The cold received him without comment, the way the north receives everyone, without welcome, without hostility, simply as a fact of the world that does not require your opinion of it. An hour up the road he found the first frozen watchtower, 2 men standing at their posts, encased in clear and perfect ice. One had his hand raised slightly, pointing at something to the north. The other had turned toward him, his face caught in the first fraction of a question. The frost on the inside of the walls grew in fine crystals from the joins between the stones, reaching inward rather than outward. The cold had not come in through the door or the window. It had come from somewhere below, somewhere deeper. Gandalf stood in the doorway for a long time looking at the 2 men. Then he stepped back out into the snow. High on the ridge above the road, barely visible through the thickening snowfall, the great pale shape of the Ivory Crown moved steadily northward, its antlers above the white line of the hills like a crown above a frozen sea. He followed. The road north of Grimholt stopped being a road within the first mile. It did not end dramatically. No washed-out bridge, no wall of fallen stone blocking the way. It simply faded, the way forgotten things fade, gradually losing definition until what had once been a deliberate cut through the landscape became indistinguishable from the landscape itself. The ruts left by cartwheels filled with snow and smoothed over. The drainage ditches on either side disappeared under drifts. The occasional marker stone placed at intervals by whoever had last maintained this route stood half-buried and tilted, their carved faces turned away from the wind as though they had grown tired of watching the empty north. Gandalf walked where the road had been, following the memory of it more than its physical presence. He had walked roads like this before, roads that the world had decided were no longer necessary and had quietly begun reclaiming. There was always something melancholy about them. They implied a time when people had traveled this way with enough regularity to make the effort of construction worthwhile. They implied a destination that had once been worth reaching. He found the tracks 20 minutes out of Grimholt. They were exactly as Aldrich had described, and somehow more unsettling in person than they had been in description. Each print was large, larger than any wolf, larger than any bear he had encountered in these latitudes, and yet they sat in the surface of the snow with a lightness that was almost delicate, as though whatever had made them weighed considerably less than its foot size suggested. They ran in a straight line from north to south and back again, parallel trails that crossed and recrossed the old road with the methodical pattern of something conducting a survey rather than a hunt. He crouched beside one of the prints and looked at it carefully. The edges were clean and precise, not softened by wind or time. Recent then, within the last day, possibly within the last few hours. The shape was broadly humanoid but wrong in the proportions. The toes too long, the arch too shallow, the whole print carrying an impression of something built for surfaces that gave way, deep snow, thin ice, loose scree, rather than solid ground. He stood and looked north along the trail. Somewhere ahead, the Ivory Crown moved through the snow. He could not see it yet, but he had learned in the hour since leaving Grimholt that the great moose had a particular way of making itself known when it wanted to be followed. It did not wait. It did not circle back. It moved at a pace slightly faster than comfortable, slightly slower than urgent, and it left its own tracks alongside the road, enormous, deeply impressed, utterly different from the pale hunter's prints in every quality. Where the pale hunter's tracks suggested something predatory and purposeful and cold, the Ivory Crown's tracks suggested weight and age and a kind of authority that had nothing to do with force. Gandalf followed them. The landscape north of Grimholt had the particular character of places that have been abandoned by everything except the weather. Dead spruce trees stood in clusters, their lower branches stripped bare by years of heavy snow, their upper branches reaching into the gray sky like the fingers of hands raised in surrender. The occasional boulder broke through the snowfield, dark and massive, wearing caps of white that the wind sculpted into strange shapes. Ravens moved between the dead trees in ones and twos, watching Gandalf with the frank professional interest that ravens brought to anything that moved through territory they considered theirs. He walked for 2 hours through this landscape, following the moose tracks before he saw the Ivory Crown again. It was standing on a high shelf of rock above the road to his left, utterly still, watching him with those pale eyes that caught light in a way no ordinary animal's eyes quite managed. At this distance and in this light he could take in the full scale of it properly for the first time. It was, there was no other word for it, colossal. Its shoulder height was well above anything the species had a right to achieve. Its antlers spread so wide and branched so elaborately that they seemed to double the creature's apparent width, each tine as thick at the base as a young tree, the whole structure pale as old bone against the gray sky. Steam rose from its nostrils in slow, regular clouds, each breath a small white flag of evidence that this was a living thing and not a vision. It looked at him for a long moment. Then it stepped off the rock shelf and moved north along the high ground above the road, not running, not hurrying, simply walking with the unhurried certainty of something that has been finding its way through this particular landscape for longer than the landscape has had its current shape. Gandalf adjusted the grip on his staff and followed. The attack came without warning at a narrow point where 2 ridges pinched the road down to a width of perhaps 8 feet, high walls of stone and compressed snow rising on either side. Gandalf had noted the narrowing as he approached it and had felt the particular kind of attention sharpen in the back of his mind that long experience had taught him to trust. He slowed his pace. He shifted his staff to his right hand. He looked at the top of the right-hand ridge without appearing to look at it. The first dagger came from the left. He moved before it arrived, pivoting on his back foot and letting it pass close enough that he heard it cut the air beside his ear. It struck the opposite wall and clattered down into the snow. He was already moving when the second came, and the third, stepping into the lee of a jutting rock and bringing his staff around in an arc that produced a burst of pale light. Not fire, not yet. Something older and more fundamental than fire, the kind of light that is less about illumination and more about declaration. They came out of the snow on both sides simultaneously. There were 7 of them. And they were nothing like the mountain orcs Gandalf had encountered in other parts of the world. Those were loud, which was their first and most reliable tactical disadvantage. These were silent. They moved in a low, fast crouch, coordinated without any signal he could detect, wearing cloaks of white fur that had been pieced together from a dozen different animals and treated with something that made them nearly invisible against the snow until they were close enough that invisibility was no longer the point. Their faces were pale, not the gray-green pallor of southern orcs, but a true white, the white of skin that had never known warmth, streaked with gray along the jaw and brow. Their eyes were pale too, almost colorless. They wore masks made from the skulls of animals Gandalf did not immediately recognize, and they carried short weapons, bone-tipped darts for distance, broad-bladed tools somewhere between a hatchet and a knife for close work. They did not roar. They did not speak. They communicated in small gestures and brief sharp sounds too high to be comfortable, not quite whistles, not quite words. something in between that carried information he couldn't decode. He was outnumbered and in a bad position, and he dealt with the first two problems the way he always dealt with them, which was by creating new problems for the people trying to kill him. He brought fire up from the head of his staff, real fire this time, hot and sudden, throwing orange light against the pale walls of the pass, and swept it in a low arc that forced the nearest three back and bought him 2 seconds of space. He used the 2 seconds to move deeper into the pass rather than back out of it, which was the direction they expected, and the recalculation this required from them bought him 2 more seconds, and 2 seconds at a time was how he had survived most of the situations in his long life that had genuinely tried to kill him. He was on the 4th pair of seconds and beginning to calculate whether he had enough fire left for a 5th when the sound came from above. It was not a loud sound. It was the sound of something very heavy shifting its weight on a surface that could not quite support it, followed immediately by the low concussive thump of a large mass of snow detaching from a height and beginning to move. The orcs heard it before Gandalf did. He saw their pale eyes move upward simultaneously, saw the expressions beneath the bone masks shift in a way that was legible even through the disguise, and then the snow came down. Not all of it. A targeted portion of the snowpack on the right-hand ridge, the portion that had been sitting in unstable balance above the narrowest point of the pass, the portion that a very large and very deliberate animal had chosen to step on at a very specific moment. It came down across the rear half of the group, not burying them, it was not that volume of snow, but scattering them, separating them, filling the pass behind them with a churned wall of white that would take several minutes to climb through. In the sudden, reconfigured silence, Gandalf walked out the north end of the pass. He looked up at the ridge. The Ivory Crown stood at the edge, looking down at him. Steam rose from its nostrils. Its antlers were enormous against the sky. It regarded him for a moment with those steady, ancient eyes, and then it turned and walked north again, its hooves finding purchase on the icy rock with a sureness that suggested it had been walking on surfaces like this since before the rock had cooled. Gandalf watched it go. "Thank you," he said, to the wind and the snow and whatever was listening. He found the man in the snow an hour later. He almost missed him, a shape too regular to be a rock, too still to be anything living, half buried in a drift at the side of the old road where someone had clearly crawled to get out of the wind and then not crawled any further. Gandalf crouched beside him and pressed 2 fingers to his neck and found a pulse, weak and irregular, the pulse of a body that had decided to spend its remaining resources on the absolute minimum. He got the man's eyes open with some difficulty. They were dark brown and not entirely focused, and for a moment they moved across Gandalf's face without recognition or comprehension. Then something sharpened in them, not full awareness, but the precursor to it, the first pale light of consciousness returning. "Easy," Gandalf said. "You're not dead yet." The man's lips moved. Gandalf leaned closer. "North," the man said. His voice was barely a sound, more the shape of a word than the word itself. They don't kill you. They take you. They're taking everyone." He stopped, breathed, tried again. "To the city, to the ice. They're taking everyone to the ice city." "Who takes them?" Gandalf asked. "The Pale Hunters?" "The Pale Hunters." A pause, another difficult breath. "And the one above them. The one who—" He didn't finish the sentence. Gandalf stayed with him until it was clear that whatever the man had left to say was going to remain unsaid. Then he pulled the man's cloak tighter around him, positioned him so the drift would break the worst of the wind, and stood. To the north, barely visible through the snowfall that had thickened over the past hour, the great pale shape of the Ivory Crown moved steadily onward, its antlers cutting the skyline like the towers of something enormous and forgotten but not yet gone. Gandalf looked at the dying man in the snow. He looked at the moose on the horizon. He walked north. The tower appeared out of the snowfall gradually, reluctantly, as though the storm was deciding how much of it to reveal and in what order. First, the base, a dark mass of stone too regular to be natural, pressed against the foot of a rock face as though it had grown there over centuries. Then the walls, rising higher than expected, dark with age and the gray-black color that northern stone achieved after endless cycles of freezing and thawing. Then the top, where the bell housing sat open to the sky, the bell itself visible from below, cracked cleanly down one side, its interior packed with ice that had forced the split wider over years of expanding and contracting until what had once been an instrument was now simply a broken thing wearing its damage openly, like a wound that had long since stopped hurting. The Ivory Crown stood at the base of the tower to the left of the entrance, not blocking it, simply present, the way it was always present, as a fact, as a fixed point, as something that had arrived at a decision and was waiting to observe whether Gandalf would arrive at the same one. He looked at the tower. He looked at the moose. The great creature's breath rose in slow clouds from its nostrils, and its antlers were motionless against the gray sky, and it did not move toward the entrance. "You won't go in," Gandalf said. The Ivory Crown looked at him with those pale, steady eyes and remained exactly where it was. He pushed the door open with the butt of his staff and went inside alone. The tower was a single circular room at ground level with a stone staircase winding up the inner wall to the floors above. It was colder inside than outside, which should not have been possible, and was. The cold here had a quality of permanence. The cold of a space that had not held warmth in a very long time and had settled into its low temperature the way water finds the lowest point available and stays there. The floor was bare stone. The walls were not. Frescoes covered them from floor to ceiling, running in two continuous bands around the full circumference of the room. Not rough work, careful, deliberate, made by someone who understood both the craft and the subject. The lower band was narrative. A royal procession moving through a winter landscape, a coronation in a great hall, a midwinter festival around a central fire, armies marching north under banners Gandalf did not recognize but whose design spoke of age and intention. The upper band was more symbolic. A crown above a mountain range, a fire burning in a stone circle, a river with names carved along its banks in the old northern script, and throughout both bands, appearing and reappearing with the regularity of a signature, the same image. A white moose with antlers so vast and so elaborately branched they could only have been drawn from life, walking at the head of a royal procession, standing at the center of a coronation scene, its enormous head turned toward the proceedings with an expression that, even rendered in pigment centuries old and faded by damp, conveyed something more than animal presence, something attending, something that understood the weight of what it witnessed and had chosen to be there. Gandalf stood before one of these images for a long moment without moving. He had suspected since Grimholt, since Edric's careful story told in layers beside a dying fire. Now the suspicion had the solidity of evidence behind it. The Ivory Crown had not simply been a legend that happened to have a living referent. It had been a constant, a witness to the kingdom's entire history from foundation to whatever had ended it, and it was still here, standing outside a ruined watchtower in the snow, waiting for him to finish reading the walls. He turned away from the frescoes and looked at the man he had half carried through the last mile of snowfield. The scout's name was Brennan. He had been part of a small company of rangers whose purpose was monitoring the northern passes and reporting anything unusual to the settlements below. The company had numbered 8 when the season began. He was, as far as he knew, the only one who had not been taken. Enough consciousness had returned for him to sit upright against the curved wall, wrapped in everything Gandalf could spare from his pack, a small fire burning between them from dry wood found stacked in the upper room, left by whoever had last used this tower for its intended purpose. Years or decades ago, the fire helped. Color returned to Brennan's face slowly and in the wrong order, the way color always returned to things after deep cold. He had seen one of the farmsteads taken from a ridge above it through the snowfall at the actual moment it happened. His words kept failing him at the crucial point, reaching for the right description and finding nothing in his experience that matched what he needed to say. What he could say was this: a sound, very low, felt in the chest more than heard by the ears. A change in the quality of the light, brief and blue and complete, like the sky deciding something. And then the farmstead below was exactly as it had been. Every building intact, every animal in its pen, except for the silence and the smoke from the chimney that had stopped rising and simply hung above the roof in a column that the wind would not touch. "The pale hunters are not like the orcs of the mountain passes," Brennan said. His voice was rough but steadier than it had been in the snow. "Mountain orcs are loud. Loudness is part of how they fight. These are not loud. They move like wolves move when wolves are working. Low, coordinated, no wasted sound, as though they were trained out of every habit that produces noise." He looked at his hands. "Their skin is white, not pale. White, like the snow around them. Their armor is bone and black iron, and the black iron has frost on it that does not melt. I understand how that sounds. I am telling you what I saw." "There is someone above them," Gandalf said. "Someone who directs them." Brennan was quiet for a moment. The fire moved in some draft from the stairwell above. "I saw him once," he said, "on the wall of the Ice City, at distance, through the snow, very tall. Something on his head that was not a metal crown, something that caught the light differently, like glass, like ice shaped into the form of a crown." He stopped. "Even at that distance, there was something about the way he stood that made me feel as though I was already inside something. As though the boundary I believed I was standing outside of, I was already on the wrong side of." Gandalf looked at the frescoed walls, at the image of the white moose walking beside kings who had been dead for centuries. "I know what it was," he said quietly. "I am beginning to understand what it has made of itself." He took the first watch and climbed to the upper room, where the broken bell sat in its housing open to the sky, and the wind arrived without any obstruction at all. He stood in the cold and looked north through the thinning snowfall. In the gaps between moving walls of white, he could see the distant landscape in brief glimpses, ridgelines, a frozen river, and beyond it, at a distance that should have put it below the horizon, the faint, dark suggestion of walls, towers, the outline of something built with the intention of permanence, barely distinguishable from the surrounding darkness, the kind of thing you could explain away as shadow or cloud if you needed to explain it away. He looked at it until the snow closed again. Below the tower, the Ivory Crown stood in the same position it had occupied since they arrived, motionless in the wind, its antlers against the sky, looking north with an attention so sustained and so patient it did not seem like waiting at all. It seemed like knowing. The attack came 3 hours before dawn, which was when experienced hunters attacked, late enough for the deepest sleep, early enough for total darkness. Gandalf was not asleep. He heard the careful sounds of weight on the outer stonework while they were still on the wall, and was standing in the center of the lower room with his staff in hand when the first window cover came inward. They entered through both windows at once, 2 through each, dropping to the stone floor with the practiced lightness of creatures that had done this before. More remained outside. He could hear the brief high signals passing between them, not quite whistles, not quite language, something efficient and cold that carried information without wasting anything on expression. He brought light up from the staff, sudden, strong, the kind of light that was less about illumination and more about the declaration that something ancient and not easily extinguished was present in the room. In that brightness, he saw all four of them clearly for the first time at close range: the bone masks, the frost-covered armor with its impossible permanent ice, the broad, pale weapons, the white faces beneath the masks that turned away from the light instinctively and then turned back. They were fast, disciplined. They made no sound even when the fight went against them, which was the most unsettling thing about them. Pain that produces no sound feels like a different order of pain entirely, the pain of something that has been doing this long enough to have left ordinary response behind. He drove, too, back through the windows with concentrated fire from the staff and dealt with the remaining two in the close curve of the circular room, using the walls to prevent them flanking him. When the last of them went back through the window, he stood in the sudden silence of the room and listened. From outside came a sound, brief, massive, the sound of something very large moving at speed through several smaller obstacles. Then the particular scrambling of things hastily reconsidering their position. He looked through the window. The Ivory Crown stood at the base of the tower, its breath rising in heavy clouds, its head slightly lowered. Around it, the remaining orcs were withdrawing into the darkness, not fleeing, but moving with a purpose that had entirely reversed direction. The great moose watched them go without pursuit. It had made its point and considered the point sufficient. It raised its head and looked up at the window. Gandalf looked back at it for a long moment. In the first gray suggestion of approaching dawn, the shadow of its antlers fell across the snow below in long branching lines that looked from above almost exactly like a crown laid flat upon the ground. He went downstairs to add wood to the fire. Brennan was still sleeping. Outside, the north was quiet. For now, the road revealed itself slowly, the way buried things always did, not all at once, but in pieces, each piece requiring the previous one to make sense. A stone that was too flat and too evenly placed to be natural, then another 10 feet further on at the same depth beneath the snow, then the suggestion of a raised edge running parallel to the direction of travel, the ghost of a drainage channel. Then a marker stone, half buried and leaning, its carved face turned away from the wind, and on that face, when Gandalf brushed the snow from it, a name, a royal name, in the old northern script, worn almost to illegibility but still present, still insisting on itself after however many centuries of weather had tried to erase it. He stopped and looked at the marker stone for a long moment. This was not a trade road. Trade roads did not have royal names carved into their markers. Trade roads did not have drainage channels cut with this kind of precision or stones laid with this kind of intention. This was something older and more deliberate, a road built to be used for a specific purpose, on specific occasions, by specific people. A processional road. The kind of road that existed not primarily for the movement of goods or armies, but for the movement of meaning. Kings had walked here, or ridden here, on the great ceremonial occasions that kingdoms invented to remind themselves and everyone watching that they were kingdoms. The Ivory Crown walked ahead of him on this road without hesitation, its enormous hooves finding the buried stones beneath the snow as though it could feel them through the depth of winter, as though the road was as present to it as if it had been cleared and swept that morning. Its antlers moved slightly with each step in a way that caught the flat gray light and scattered it. Its breath rose in steady white clouds that the wind pulled apart almost immediately. Gandalf followed, reading the road as he walked. The markers came at intervals of perhaps 200 feet, each one bearing a name or a date or a brief phrase in the old script. He translated them as he passed, assembling from their fragments a rough chronology of the kingdom that had built this road. The earliest markers were simple, a name, a year, nothing more. The later ones were more elaborate, suggesting a civilization that had grown more interested in recording itself as it aged, the way people became more interested in their own history as they sensed it might be ending. Between the markers, the road told its own story. Here, the stone beneath the snow was cracked and heaved by frost, the careful engineering of the original construction defeated by centuries of water finding its way into joints and freezing and expanding. There, a section of the raised roadbed had subsided entirely, the ground beneath it having shifted or settled, leaving a depression that the snow had filled to a deceptive smoothness. In several places, trees had fallen across the road and lay there still, slowly being absorbed into the landscape, their root systems having lost the argument with the weight of accumulated ice. But the road persisted, underneath everything that had happened to it. The intention of the original builders persisted, the insistence that this route mattered, that whatever lay at its end was worth reaching, that the distance between here and there was worth the effort of making passable. Gandalf found himself thinking about the people who had built it. Not the kings whose names were on the markers, but the others. The ones who had cut and placed and leveled and drained, who had worked in this cold with the tools available to them and produced something that had outlasted everyone who remembered why it had been built. There was a particular kind of dignity in that, a particular kind of persistence that had nothing to do with glory. The Ivory Crown stopped. It stopped so abruptly that Gandalf, who had been reading a marker stone and not watching the road ahead as carefully as he should have been, was 20 feet past it before he registered the absence of movement ahead and turned back. The great moose stood in the center of the road with its head raised and its nostrils working, its ears, large, mobile, oriented with a precision that made Gandalf's own senses feel crude by comparison. Angled forward and slightly left. He stopped moving. He stopped making any sound beyond breathing. For perhaps 30 seconds, nothing happened. The wind moved through the dead spruce trees on either side of the road with a low, sustained note. Snow fell, not heavily but steadily, the kind of snowfall that did not announce itself but simply accumulated. Then the figures appeared at the far end of the road. They came out of the snowfall rather than through it, materializing at the edge of visibility with the gradual resolution of things that had been there for some time before they chose to be seen. They were tall, taller than the pale hunters Gandalf had encountered in the mountain pass, and differently shaped, thinner, more elongated, wearing pale robes rather than the fur and bone armor of the snow orcs. Their faces were covered by masks, but these were not the animal skull masks of the hunters. These were smooth and featureless and white, shaped to the human face but emptied of everything that made a face, and across their surfaces ran patterns of fine cracked lines, like the patterns that formed on ice when it was under stress. Frost masks. Ice priests. There were 4 of them, standing in a line across the road at a distance of perhaps 100 feet. They did not carry weapons, or not weapons in any conventional sense. Each one held a staff of pale wood, and at the tip of each staff a small, cold light burned, blue-white, the color of the light Gandalf had seen on the distant horizon from Grimholt, the color of the light that had no warmth in it at all. They began to move their staffs in slow, coordinated arcs, and where the light from the staffs traced its path through the air, ice formed. Not gradually, instantly, a wall of it rising from the road surface in a continuous sheet, climbing toward a height that would close the road entirely, its surface smooth and clear as glass, the snowfall behind it visible through it in a distorted way, the trees and the darkness beyond rendered strange by the refraction. The wall rose. Gandalf watched it for a moment, calculating. Then, from behind him and from both sides simultaneously, the pale hunters came out of the trees. He had known they were there, or he had known something was there, the particular quality of silence that surrounds things trying to be silent, which was a different quality from genuine silence, and which he had been noticing for the past several minutes without having quite resolved it into certainty. The certainty arrived now in the form of a dozen pale hunters emerging from the tree line on both sides of the road in the coordinated, unhurried way that meant they believed they had already won and were simply executing the final stage of a plan. He did not give them the final stage. He brought fire from the staff in a wide horizontal arc, not aimed at any individual target but designed to occupy space, to create a boundary of heat and light that required a response, that interrupted the coordinated advance and forced each hunter to make an individual decision rather than executing the collective one. Several of them pulled back. 2 did not, and he dealt with those 2 in the few seconds the others spent recalculating. The ice wall ahead was still rising. He turned toward it and pushed, not fire this time, but the other thing, the older thing, the will that underlay fire and preceded it, the thing that fire was an expression of rather than a thing in itself. The wall cracked. A vertical fracture ran from base to top in an instant, and through the fracture, cold air moved in a rush that he could feel on his face, and the fracture widened, and then the ivory crown hit the wall. It hit it at full stride, which was a stride that covered more ground than seemed geometrically possible, with its head lowered and its antlers forward, and the full mass of something ancient and enormous moving at the speed of something that had decided to move. The wall did not shatter so much as cease. One moment it was there, and the next, the road ahead was clear, and the ice priests were stepping back from the impact with their coordinated calm broken for the first time, their staffs interrupting their slow arcs, the blue lights flickering. The pale hunters behind Gandalf had made their individual decisions. Most of them had decided against continuing. 2 had not, and they came at him from either side in a fast, low rush, and he turned to meet them with fire in one hand and the staff in the other, and it was brief and decisive and left him standing alone in the road with the snow falling around him and the sound of the surviving hunters and the retreating ice priests fading into the trees. The ivory crown stood in the road ahead of him facing north. Its breath came faster than usual, the only sign it gave of what it had just done. Its antlers were intact. Its pale eyes looked forward. After a moment, it began to walk again, steady and unhurried, back to the pace it kept when the road was clear. Gandalf followed. An hour later, the road crested a long rise and the landscape opened ahead of them. The snowfall had thinned to almost nothing. In the cold, clear air across a wide frozen river that caught the last of the gray afternoon light, the silhouettes of towers rose against the sky. Massive, dark, connected by walls that stretched further than a single glance could contain, pressed against a glacier that rose behind them like a second and more permanent kind of wall. The Kingdom of Ice. Gandalf stood at the crest of the rise and looked at it for a long time. The ivory crown stood beside him, not ahead for once, but beside him, its enormous head level with his shoulder, both of them looking at the same thing. The towers were dark against the last light. No smoke rose from them. No movement showed on the walls. But from somewhere within that darkness, from somewhere deep beneath those walls and that glacier, a cold blue light pulsed with the slow regularity of something that had been beating for a very long time and intended to continue. The north was waiting. Gandalf tightened his grip on his staff and began the descent toward the river. The frozen river was wider than it had appeared from the ridge. Distance and cold had compressed it in his perception, made it seem crossable in minutes, a brief inconvenience between where he stood and where he needed to be. Up close it was something else entirely. Perhaps 300 feet from bank to bank, its surface a pale gray-white that was neither truly ice nor truly snow, but some combination of both, layered over the course of many winters into a surface that looked solid and probably was solid and carried, nonetheless, the particular visual quality of things that could not be fully trusted. He stood at the bank for a moment and looked across. On the far side, the kingdom's outer walls rose in the middle distance. dark stone against white landscape, their scale difficult to gauge without reference points. Larger than the towers had suggested from the ridge. The walls ran east and west, further than he could see clearly, following the natural line of a glacial moraine that had provided both foundation and additional defense to whoever had built them. At intervals, towers broke the line of the wall, round, thick, built to last rather than to impress. The architecture of people who had understood that the North did not reward ornamentation. The Ivory Crown walked to the edge of the bank and stepped onto the ice without pausing. Where its hooves met the surface, something happened. Not dramatic, not light, not sound, nothing that announced itself. Simply a quality change in the ice beneath each step, a subtle shift from the gray uncertainty of the general surface to something fractionally clearer, fractionally more solid, as though the weight of the great creature pressing down was somehow confirming the ice rather than testing it. Gandalf watched this for a moment, understanding without being able to explain it, and then stepped onto the ice himself and followed the path the moose was making. The cold on the river was different from the cold on the land. On the land, cold was a condition of the air. On the river, it rose from below as well, a two-directional cold, above and beneath simultaneously, the ice conducting the temperature of the water under it upward through the soles of his boots in a way that was distinct and insistent. He could feel the river moving under him, not hear it. The ice was too thick for sound to pass through, but feel it, the faint and continuous pressure of water that had not frozen all the way down and was still moving somewhere in the dark below, still asserting its nature against the season that was trying to stop it. He kept his eyes on the Ivory Crown ahead and watched the surface around him as he walked. Halfway across, the surface changed. It changed gradually, the way dangerous things on ice always changed, not with a crack or a lurch, but with a subtle shift in the visual texture of the surface, the ice becoming marginally less opaque, the gray-white becoming gray-clear, and through that clarity, depths. Through the ice, things were visible, not clearly, not with any detail that resolved into certainty, but the suggestions were there in the blue-gray darkness below the surface. Shapes too regular to be the natural geography of a riverbed, long shapes, arranged with a spacing and an orientation that did not occur in nature. He looked down as he walked, and the shapes moved past beneath him slowly, and the longer he looked, the more his mind supplied what his eyes could not quite confirm. The outline of a face here, the suggestion of a hand there, the particular stillness of things that had once moved and no longer did. The river had been here before the kingdom fell. It had been flowing past the walls when the cold came. Whatever the cold had done to the people in the streets and the farms and the watchtowers, the river had received a version of it, not the same, not identical, but related. Things had entered the water and the water had kept them, in the way the ice kept everything here, in the way that seemed like preservation and was actually something more complicated and less kind. He looked away from the depths and focused on the far bank. The Ivory Crown had stopped ahead of him. It stood with its head raised, its ears forward, its entire attention directed at the eastern bank. Gandalf stopped too and looked. Nothing visible. Snow, ice, the line of the bank, the beginning of the road that led toward the walls. Then the ice to his left moved. Not broke. Moved. A section of the surface, perhaps 20 feet away, shifted upward fractionally, as though something below it had pressed against it from underneath, testing the thickness, calculating. Then it settled. Then it moved again, further along, closer. He understood what was happening a moment before it happened. They came up through the pre-cut holes made earlier from below, while the ice was being watched from above. The pale hunters had been in the water, or close enough to the underside of the ice to have prepared this, and they came up through 3 openings simultaneously, water streaming from their white fur cloaks, their bone weapons already raised, moving with the particular focused efficiency of a plan executing its final stage. From the eastern bank, more emerged from the snowbank above the waterline. A second group, positioned to close the gap between the river hunters and the bank to prevent the obvious response of simply running for solid ground. Gandalf did not run for solid ground. He turned toward the nearest group, the ones still dripping river water, and brought fire down from the staff in a concentrated point rather than a sweep. Not the wide arc he used for crowds, but the precise application he used for specific problems, the kind of fire that did not spread unless directed to spread. It hit the ice between him and the nearest hunter, and the ice did not simply melt. It cracked, a radiating fracture that moved outward from the point of impact in 4 directions simultaneously, and along one of those directions was the hunter, and the section of ice he was standing on tilted and dropped, and the hunter went with it into the dark water below. The second hunter reached him before he could redirect the staff, and the fight became close and immediate and not particularly elegant. He used the staff as a physical object, length, leverage, the simple mechanics of a long piece of solid wood in a small space, and the hunter was fast but fighting on unstable ice in wet clothing in extreme cold, which created disadvantages that discipline alone could not compensate for. The third hunter pulled back. From the bank, the second group was crossing the ice toward him, 4 of them moving in the low, fast way they always moved, spreading out to prevent him addressing all of them at once. The Ivory Crown moved. It had been still since the attack began, which Gandalf had noticed without having time to interpret. Now it moved with a sudden explosive force that was startling even knowing what it was, covering the distance between itself and the advancing hunters in a series of strides that seemed to compress the space they crossed. Its antlers lowered, its breath coming in hard, fast clouds. It hit the leftmost hunter with its shoulder rather than its antlers, a blow that lifted the hunter entirely off the ice and deposited him several feet to the right. The hunter hit the surface hard and did not immediately get up. The remaining 3 split apart, their coordinated advance broken, and in the moment of their recalibration, Gandalf moved through the gap they had created and onto the eastern bank. Solid ground. The particular relief of solid ground after uncertain ice. He turned back. The Ivory Crown was following him across the last section of ice, moving at a deliberate pace now, the urgency gone from its movement, its antlers rising back to their full height. Behind it, the pale hunters stood at various points on the river surface and watched it go, and not one of them moved to follow. They stood and watched the great moose cross the ice with expressions that Gandalf could not read at this distance, but which carried in the quality of their stillness something that was not quite fear and was not quite reverence and was perhaps some combination of the two that the cold had produced over a very long time. The Ivory Crown stepped onto the eastern bank and stood beside Gandalf and looked back at the river for a moment. Then it turned toward the walls ahead and began to walk. The kingdom's outer wall rose before them as they approached, higher than it had seemed from the river, the stone darker up close, the mortar between the blocks replaced in many places by ice that had grown into the joints over centuries and now held the wall together as much as any original construction. At the base of the wall, the snow was deep and undisturbed, piled against the stone in long, smooth drifts that reached halfway up the lowest course of blocks. The gates were closed. Great timber and iron gates, frozen in their frames, the iron fittings bloomed with rust beneath the ice that covered them. They had been closed for a long time, perhaps for as long as everything else here had been stopped. Above the gates on the wall's walkway, a single figure stood looking down. Not a pale hunter, not an ice priest, something else, taller than either, still in the way that the frozen people in the farmsteads were still, but not frozen, choosing stillness, wearing it the way certain kinds of authority wore stillness, as a demonstration rather than a condition. On its head, catching the gray light in a way that metal did not, something that was the shape of a crown but the substance of ice. The figure looked down at Gandalf for a long moment. Then it looked at the Ivory Crown beside him, and something changed in its posture. a fractional shift, barely perceptible, the kind of adjustment that a face makes when it sees something it has spent a long time trying not to think about. Then it turned and walked back along the wall and disappeared from view. The gates, slowly and with the sound of ice fracturing along seams that had been sealed for generations, began to open. The gates opened onto a road that had once been the main approach to the city's inner districts, wide enough for a royal procession, paved with large flat stones that the ice had heaved and cracked over the years but never destroyed. On either side, buildings pressed close. Merchants' houses, a granary with its doors hanging open, a smithy, a small temple with steps leading up to an entrance nobody had used in a very long time. The architecture was northern and honest, heavy, low, built for endurance rather than beauty, every surface angled to shed snow, every window narrow against the cold. It was the architecture of people who had understood their environment completely and built their answer to it in stone. It was also, every inch of it, enclosed in a silence so complete it had physical weight. Gandalf walked through the gates with the ivory crown at his shoulder, and the first thing he saw stopped him entirely. A man stood in the middle of the road, facing slightly away, one hand raised as though pointing at something further up the street. Frozen, but not in the rough, opaque ice of watchtower walls or river depths. Something finer, something almost transparent, like the clearest glass, preserving rather than obscuring, showing everything it held without distortion. The man's face was visible through it, turned 3/4 away, his expression carrying the simple open attention of someone indicating a direction to a companion. Beside him, a woman with her head turned toward him and her mouth open at the beginning of a word. Whatever she had been about to say had remained unsaid for however many years this had lasted. Beyond them, others. A child on the granary steps, sitting with her legs hanging over the edge, looking at a small carved figure held in both hands. A group of men outside the smithy, 3 of them mid-conversation, one caught in the middle of a laugh at something the others had not yet finished hearing. A dog curled against the base of a wall with its nose tucked under its tail, the only one of them whose expression was peaceful for reasons of its own rather than reasons of interruption. Gandalf walked slowly between them. Not dead. None of them. Death had a completion to it, the sense that the story had ended, that whatever the person had been was now entirely past tense. These people carried no such completion. They were present tense, impossibly, suspended in the middle of a moment that had not been permitted to finish. The man would point forever at whatever he had been indicating. The woman would remain perpetually at the beginning of her response. The child would hold her carved figure in the posture of examination without ever completing the examination. He understood, standing in that road with the frozen city around him, what had actually been done here. Not killing. The refusal to allow death. The Prince of Winter had caught his people in the instant before whatever had been coming for them arrived. The cold, the starvation, the collapse of everything they had built, and held them there, suspended between one moment and the next, neither living nor dead, but something the language of either condition could not accurately describe. He had looked at the approaching end of his kingdom and chosen this instead. And in his own understanding, in the architecture of his own reasoning, he had called it mercy. The Ivory Crown moved through the frozen streets differently than it moved through open country. In open country it was purposeful, always oriented toward the next point on a route only it fully understood. Here it moved slowly, and it looked at things. It paused before a woman frozen in the act of closing a shutter and stood there looking at her with those pale ancient eyes for longer than observation required. It stopped before a man who had been leading a horse, the horse also frozen, one hoof raised mid-step, and remained still in a silence that felt like acknowledgement rather than examination. At the entrance to what had been a large hall, it stood in the doorway and looked inside at the frozen figures of people who had gathered there, perhaps for warmth, perhaps for the particular comfort of not being alone when things were going badly, and the way it stood suggested it had stood in that doorway before, in a different time, when the hall had been full of sound and firelight and the noise of people going about the ordinary business of surviving winter. It had known this city. It had walked these streets when they were alive. The memory of that time was present in how it moved through the absence of it. With a grief too old and too large for any expression available to a creature that did not use words, Gandalf followed and said nothing. He found the chronicler's house by the particular worn quality of its threshold stone, which spoke of people entering and leaving with professional regularity over many years. Inside, shelves of carefully bound records covered every wall from floor to ceiling. Most were sealed by ice, their covers fused to the wood, their pages unreachable, the work of decades locked away in the same cold that had locked away everything else. But one section near the back of the room, protected from the frost by the angle of an interior wall, had survived accessible. He pulled a volume from the shelf and opened it with care. The handwriting was small and precise, the script of someone who had spent a lifetime recording things and had developed a deep economy in the process. He turned to the final pages, the entries closest to the end of the writing. The winters had been worsening for years, not all at once, steadily, each one arriving earlier and lasting longer than the previous, the summers between them shrinking until warmth in this latitude became almost theoretical. The harvests had failed 2 years running, livestock were dying. People from the outlying settlements had moved into the city, consuming supplies faster than they could be replenished. The king had died. The chronicler recorded the fact with a brevity that suggested either grief or the exhaustion of someone who had been writing bad news for too long. The elder prince had died shortly after. The younger prince had taken the throne. The entries about the younger prince were written with the careful neutrality of someone composing an official record while privately thinking things the official record could not contain. He was described as devoted, unwilling to accept what the circumstances seemed to require him to accept. In the final entries, the language shifted, not dramatically, but enough. Words like preparation and necessity and the deep winter knowledge appeared without explanation, as though the chronicler understood what they referred to and could not bring himself to write it plainly. The last entry was 3 lines. The prince has gone below. The light above the palace has changed color. I do not think morning will come in the way that morning has always come. I am going to sit with my family. Gandalf closed the volume and set it back on the shelf. Outside, somewhere in the frozen streets, he could hear the Ivory Crown moving, the slow, heavy sound of those enormous hooves on stone, methodical and patient, passing through the city like a memory of what it had been. The ice priests found him in the chronicler's house. They came through the doorway without haste, 4 of them in their pale robes with their smooth cracked masks, their staffs casting the cold blue light that threw no shadows worth having. They did not speak. They moved to positions around the room with the practiced geometry of people who had done this before, each one taking a corner, each one raising their staff to begin the slow, arcing motion that preceded the ice. Gandalf was already moving. He came out of the back of the room through a narrow door that led into an alley between the chronicler's house and the building beside it, and behind him he heard the ice forming, the sharp crystalline sound of it, rapid and purposeful, sealing the doorway he had come through a moment after he was no longer in it. He moved down the alley at speed, the cold air hitting his face, the narrow passage amplifying the sound of his own footsteps against the stone. The pale hunters were in the street at the alley's end. He turned back. The ice priests were at the other end. their blue lights visible around the corner, their measured footsteps approaching with the unhurried confidence of people managing an enclosure rather than conducting a chase. From above and to the left came a sound, the particular sound of something very large moving on a rooftop, followed by the groan of old timber taking a weight it had not anticipated, followed by a section of the building wall beside the alley coming outward, not collapsing, being pushed deliberately with force and precision, a section of the upper wall driven outward by something pressing against it from inside the building. The section of wall fell into the street on the hunters' side of the alley mouth, and the hunters scattered from it, and in the gap their scattering created, Gandalf moved through and into the open street. The Ivory Crown stood in the street beyond, breathing hard, plaster dust and old timber fragments caught in its antlers. It had gone through the building rather than around it. The building had lost the argument. From further up the street, from the direction of the palace, a figure appeared on a high balcony and looked down at the commotion below. Tall, still, wearing something on its head that caught the gray light in the way ice caught light, differently from metal, with a coldness that was not merely visual. It looked down at Gandalf, then it looked at the Ivory Crown standing in the ruined street below, and its stillness changed in quality, became something harder, something older, something that had been waiting beneath the surface of its composure for a very long time. Then it turned and went back inside. Gandalf looked at the balcony for a moment after it had gone. Then he looked at the Ivory Crown, which was already facing north, already oriented toward the palace at the city's heart, already beginning to move. He followed. The frozen city watched them pass in silence. All those stopped faces looking at nothing, all those interrupted moments persisting in their amber of perfect cold, waiting for something that might never come, or might, if the next few hours went differently than the last several years, come at last. The palace rose ahead of them, dark and massive, its towers catching the last of the failing light. The white forest began at the city's eastern wall, where the stonework ended and the tree line started with an abruptness that suggested the trees had been deliberately kept back from the walls once and had spent the intervening years reclaiming the distance. They were old trees, spruce and pine mostly, but grown into shapes that normal spruce and pine did not achieve, their lower branches stripped bare by decades of heavy snow, their upper branches reaching into the gray sky with a reaching quality that felt less botanical and more like supplication. The frost had taken every surface, bark, branch, the few dead leaves that still clung to the occasional birch, and covered it uniformly in white, so that the forest presented itself as a single continuous thing rather than a collection of individual trees, a forest of bone, a forest of white fingers and white arms and white silence. Gandalf had chosen it over the open streets for the obvious reason. In the streets he was visible from every window and every rooftop and every section of wall, and the ice priests and the pale hunters had demonstrated that they understood how to use that visibility. In the forest he would be harder to track and harder to surround, and the trees would limit the angles from which he could be approached simultaneously. The Ivory Crown had not required explanation. When Gandalf moved toward the eastern wall, it had moved with him, and when he found the gap in the stonework where a section had collapsed inward and filled the breach with decades of accumulated debris, it had gone through first, its enormous body displacing the snow and old stone with a patience that made the gap navigable. Inside the forest it moved differently than it moved anywhere else. In open country it was a landmark, visible, unmistakable, its white coat and vast antlers making it the most identifiable thing in any landscape it occupied. In the forest it became something else, the white coat that made it conspicuous against gray sky and open snowfield made it nearly invisible among the frost-covered trees, and it moved through the undergrowth with a silence that its size should have made impossible, placing each enormous hoof with a care and precision that suggested it had been moving through forests like this one since before the trees currently standing had been seeds. It knew this place, or knew places like it so thoroughly that the knowledge was fully transferable. Gandalf followed its lead and kept his own movement as quiet as circumstances allowed. 20 minutes into the forest, the Ivory Crown stopped. It stopped in the way it stopped when it was not simply pausing to orient itself. Fully, weight settled, head raised, ears forward, and working independently, processing information from directions Gandalf's own senses could not yet reach. He stopped immediately and stood still and listened. The forest was quiet, but it was a different quiet than it had been. A quiet with a texture to it, a quiet that had recently replaced sound rather than simply being the absence of it. The birds that had been moving in the upper branches had stopped moving. The wind, which had been producing a low note in the higher branches, had dropped to nothing. He looked left, he looked right, he looked back along the way they had come. Nothing visible. But the Ivory Crown's ears had not moved from their forward and right orientation, and the great creature's nostrils were working steadily, reading the air with an attention that did not waver. Gandalf shifted his grip on his staff and waited. The first torch appeared between the trees to the north, a pale blue flame, cold rather than hot, the kind of light that illuminated without warming. Then a second, further east, then a third to the south, behind them, closing the triangle. Between the torches, movement, figures in white moving through the white trees with the low, coordinated efficiency that he had come to recognize as the Pale Hunter's fundamental mode of operation. Not rushing, not making the noise that rushing made. Simply moving into position with the patient geometry of experienced hunters who had done this before and understood that patience was more reliable than speed. They were not simply pursuing, they were driving, pushing toward a specific point, using the torch positions to create boundaries, herding rather than chasing. Somewhere ahead, he understood there would be an endpoint to this geometry, a place they were being moved toward rather than simply away from. He did not go toward it. He turned sharp left, away from the most visible cluster of torches, and moved through the trees at a speed that traded silence for distance. The Ivory Crown came with him immediately, its course adjustment instantaneous, and for a few minutes the forest gave them the advantage of its density, the trees close enough together that the hunters' coordinated movement was interrupted, their lines of sight broken, their geometry disrupted by the simple physical fact of obstacles. Then the trees thinned and the hunters adapted and the torches realigned. The chase that followed was not elegant. It moved through the forest in a series of adjustments and counter-adjustments, each one buying a minute or two before the hunters recalibrated. Gandalf used fire twice, not to fight, but to obstruct, dropping burning branches across paths behind him, creating barriers that required the hunters to go around rather than through and cost them the time that going around always cost. The hunters responded by splitting their formation, sending flanking groups through sections of forest that the fire did not reach, maintaining the pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. The Ivory Crown navigated. That was the only word for what it did. Not simply moving through the forest, but actively reading it, choosing paths with a speed and certainty that could not have come from anything other than deep knowledge. It avoided the places where the snow was thin over frozen streams. It found passages through thickets that looked impenetrable from any approach but the one it chose. At one point, it led Gandalf up a ridge that seemed to be leading them into a dead end against a rock face, and then turned along the base of the rock face to a snow-filled depression that was not a depression at all, but the entrance to a dry gully running east, invisible from any direction except the one the moose had approached it from. The hunters lost them twice, found them again twice. The third time they lost them, the torches converged on the wrong location. Gandalf could see the cold blue lights clustering to the north, moving through the trees in the direction they had been going before the gully, and he stood in the gully and watched the lights and breathed slowly and let his heartbeat return to something closer to its ordinary rhythm. The Ivory Crown stood beside him, its breath coming faster than usual, steam rising from its coat in the cold air. It was the most evidence of effort it had ever shown. It stood and breathed and looked at the distant torches with an expression that, on a creature with a human face, would have been called satisfaction. The hunters found them again because one of them was better than the others. He came from downwind, alone, without a torch, moving through the trees with a stillness that was different in quality from the stillness of the others. More individual, less trained, the stillness of someone who had developed it personally over a long time rather than learned it as part of a collective discipline. He came within 20 feet before either Gandalf or the Ivory Crown registered his presence, and he came with a short bone spear already drawn back, and he was fast. The spear was aimed at the moose. Gandalf moved the staff and the spear deflected, not far, but enough. It struck the rock face of the gully rather than its intended target, and the sound it made striking stone was loud in the silence, and the hunter knew immediately that the advantage of surprise was gone and adjusted without hesitation, drawing a second weapon and closing the remaining distance before Gandalf could reset. The fight in the gully was close and short, and ended with the hunter on the ground and the distant torches already changing direction in response to the noise. Gandalf looked at the converging lights. The Ivory Crown was already moving deeper into the gully, toward a darkness at its far end that resolved as Gandalf followed into the mouth of something he had not expected, a passage, low and wide, cut into the rock face with the kind of deliberate regularity that did not occur in nature. Stone steps descending, old torch brackets on the walls, empty. The smell of deep cold and deep age and something beneath both of those that was harder to name. He looked back at the forest. The torches were close now, their cold blue light filtering between the trees, the sound of careful movement audible even at this distance. He looked at the passage. The Ivory Crown had already descended several steps and stood looking back at him from the darkness below with those pale, steady eyes, its antlers almost touching the ceiling of the passage, its breath rising in the confined space in slow clouds that drifted upward and disappeared. Gandalf followed it down. Behind him, the entrance to the passage was framed for a moment by the blue light of the hunters' torches as they reached the gully mouth. Then he was around the first bend in the staircase, and the light was gone, and there was only the deep dark of underground and the sound of the Ivory Crown moving ahead of him, steady and unhurried, into whatever lay beneath the frozen city. The passage descended for longer than the rock face above it should have allowed. Gandalf counted steps by habit, an old habit, useful in underground places where distance became unreliable, and the sense of how far one had traveled was the first thing the darkness took. He counted to 200 before the staircase leveled into a horizontal corridor, and the corridor ran straight for what his sense of distance put at perhaps 400 feet, and then opened into something that was not a room in any architectural sense, but was not a cave either. Something between the two, a space that had been natural originally and had been worked over time, its walls squared and smoothed in some places and left raw in others, its ceiling lost in darkness above the reach of the light his staff produced. The light his staff produced was the only light, and in that light the space revealed itself in pieces. Columns first, not built columns but carved ones, shaped from the living rock of the cave floor and ceiling, rough at their bases where the original stone had been left intentionally unfinished and more refined toward their centers where the carvers had spent their effort. Between the columns, the floor was flat and carefully leveled, and on the floor were objects, not random objects, arranged objects, placed with intention, the placement of things that meant something to whoever had put them there. Weapons, some of them, though the weapons were ceremonial in character rather than practical, their blades too long and too ornate for actual use. Containers of various sizes and materials, sealed. Carvings, standing upright in rows, their faces worn to near illegibility but their postures still communicating, figures with their arms raised, figures with their heads bowed, figures in attitudes of offering or supplication that crossed the boundaries of any specific cultural tradition and went straight to something more fundamental, a vault, an underground vault built beneath the city and predating it, or built with the city as its foundation. The thing below the thing, the layer of meaning that the visible structure had been built on top of. The ivory crown moved through the columns slowly, its antlers passing between them with a margin that suggested familiarity with their spacing, and Gandalf followed, turning his staff's light toward each new section of the space as it revealed itself. At the vault's far end, a wall, not a blank wall, a wall that had been the subject of sustained and serious attention, covered from floor to ceiling in carving so dense and so layered that it took several minutes of looking before the individual elements resolved from the general complexity. The same archaic northern script that appeared on the road markers and the tower frescoes, but more of it, running in horizontal bands between the images. The images themselves were larger and more detailed than anything in the tower, scenes from the kingdom's founding, the first king's arrival in the north, the building of the city, the establishment of the midwinter festival, and above all of these, larger than all of these, the central image, a figure on a throne, and above the figure's head, not resting on it but hovering above it, the ivory crown, rendered in the stone with the care of something sacred, its antlers spread across the full width of the carving, its presence framing the king below it like a living canopy. And beside the throne, carved with the same seriousness as the king himself, a second figure, smaller, younger, standing with his hands at his sides and his face turned away from the throne and towards something at the edge of the carving that the carver had left ambiguous, a darkness at the margin, undefined, suggesting rather than depicting. Gandalf looked at the second figure for a long time. He looked at the ivory crown, which had stopped before the wall, and stood looking at the central image with an attention that was different from the attention it had given the frozen people in the streets. That attention had been grief. This was something older and more complicated, the attention of something looking at the record of its own history and finding in it both what it remembered and what had changed. The younger prince, Gandalf said quietly. He was there from the beginning. The ivory crown did not respond in any way that could be called a response, but it did not look away from the carving. The sound came from above. Not from the passage they had descended, but from somewhere further in the rock, transmitted through the stone itself, felt as much as heard, a low regular pulse, the same pulse Gandalf had seen expressed as blue light from the ridge above the frozen river. Down here it was physical rather than visual, a vibration in the floor and walls that arrived at intervals of perhaps 4 seconds, steady as a heartbeat, as though the rock itself had a pulse or was conducting someone else's. He placed his hand flat against the nearest wall. The pulse moved through his palm and up his arm with a cold that was not the ordinary cold of stone. It was directed cold, cold with intention behind it, cold that was being produced rather than simply existing, cold that had a source somewhere below or ahead and was radiating outward from that source through everything connected to it, through the rock, through the ice above the rock, through the frozen city built on top of both, through the frozen people standing in their streets. He understood then, fully and completely, what he had been walking toward since Grimholt. The pulse was not incidental to what had been done here. It was not a byproduct or a side effect. It was the mechanism. The Prince of Winter had not simply unleashed cold on his kingdom and walked away. He was still here, still below, still maintaining the condition he had created, feeding it, sustaining it, keeping the stopped moment from collapsing back into the death it had been designed to prevent. The mercy was ongoing. It required him. It had required him for however many years this had lasted. Gandalf stood with his hand against the wall and thought about that for a long moment. The passage continued beyond the vault, narrowing back to a corridor and descending again. More steeply this time, the steps cut less carefully than the ones above, the walls closer. The ivory crown went ahead, its breath visible in the confined space, its antlers occasionally brushing the ceiling with a sound of bone on stone that echoed in a way the open vault had not allowed sound to echo. The blue light grew as they descended, not from any torch or carried source, but from the walls themselves, seeping through the stone in thin lines at first, following the natural fractures in the rock, and then broadening as they went deeper until the walls on both sides were suffused with it, cold and sourceless and the same color as the light that had been visible from the ridge 2 days ago and a world away. The corridor ended at a door. The door was stone, a single massive slab fitted into the rock frame with a precision that left no gap visible at any edge, its surface covered in the same dense carving as the vault wall above. At its center, where a handle or a lock mechanism might have been, there was instead a depression in the stone shaped like a hand, a large hand, fingers spread, pressed into the rock as though someone had pushed against it from this side and the stone had recorded the pressure permanently. Beside the door, sitting with his back against the wall and his legs stretched out before him on the stone floor, was a man. Old, genuinely old. The kind of old that had moved past age as a descriptor and into something more like geology. His hair was white and long and his beard covered most of his face, and his robes, which had once been fine, were worn to a thinness that suggested they had not been changed in a very long time. His hands rested in his lap, and they were the hands from the carving above, large, the fingers long and strong even now. The hands of someone who had once done things with them. His eyes were open, and they were not frozen. He looked at Gandalf with the eyes of someone who had been waiting and who had perhaps stopped believing the waiting would ever produce anything and who was now recalibrating in real time. Then he looked at the ivory crown standing in the corridor behind Gandalf, filling the space from wall to wall, its pale eyes steady in the blue light. Something crossed the old man's face that was too complicated to name simply. Recognition, pain, something that had been held back for a very long time, arriving all at once, in an expression that had not been asked to carry anything for years, and was now being asked to carry everything. "You came," he said. His voice was rough with disuse, the voice of someone who had not spoken aloud in a very long time. He was not speaking to Gandalf. He was speaking to the moose. The ivory crown looked at him across the narrow corridor with those ancient pale eyes, and its breath rose in a slow cloud in the blue-lit dark, and it did not look away. Gandalf stood between them and said nothing, understanding that whatever was happening in this corridor, in this moment, between this old man and this ancient creature, it had been a very long time coming and required no contribution from him. The pulse in the walls continued its steady beat, patient and cold, maintaining the stopped world above. The old man's name was Edric, not the Edric of Grimholt, a different Edric, or perhaps the same name carried forward through generations of a kingdom that had run out of generations before the name could travel any further. He had been the royal chronicler, the last one, the man whose handwriting Gandalf had read in the house above, whose final entry had been 3 lines about going to sit with his family. He had not sat with his family. He had come here instead, to this corridor, to this door. He did not explain immediately why. He explained other things first, in the halting way of someone whose facility with spoken language had degraded through years of disuse, rebuilding his sentences carefully, stopping to find words that had retreated to the back of whatever internal storage words occupied when they were not being used. The prince had gone below on the night of the longest day of what would have been summer, if summer had still been a meaningful category. The chronicler had followed him, not immediately, not bravely, but eventually, pulled by the same obligation that had kept him writing long after writing had ceased to be anything other than an act of witness. Someone had to know. Someone had to be in a position to tell it, if telling ever became possible. He had reached this door and found it closed and found that he could not open it and had stayed. How long? Gandalf asked. The old man looked at the ceiling for a moment. I stopped counting at 30 years, he said. That was some time ago. Gandalf looked at him, at the impossible fact of him, alive, present, thinking, in a place where the cold should have resolved the question of his survival within the first winter. How are you alive? The chronicler looked down at his hands. The same reason the people above are preserved, he said. The pulse. It reaches this far. It touches everything down here. It has been keeping me. Whether that was intentional or simply the nature of the thing extending itself to its nearest boundary, I cannot say. A pause. I have had a great deal of time to consider the question. I have not arrived at an answer. And the prince, Gandalf said, behind this door. Behind this door. The chronicler looked at the stone slab with the expression of someone who had looked at the same thing for a very long time. He went in to find the source of the deep cold. The old cold, the cold that was here before the kingdom, before the people, before anything that had a name. He believed he could use it, direct it, that he could take the cold that was killing his kingdom and make it serve the kingdom instead. He stopped. He was not entirely wrong. What he built works. What he built has been working for however long it has been working. But, Gandalf said, but it required a cost he did not fully calculate in advance. The old man's voice was steady and very tired. It required him to stay, to remain at the source and maintain the connection, to keep choosing it, continuously, with every moment of every day. He is not frozen. He is not stopped the way the others are stopped. He is present and awake and aware, and he has been present and awake and aware, alone in whatever is behind that door, for longer than I have been sitting outside it. The Ivory Crown, which had been standing motionless in the corridor behind Gandalf, made a sound, not loud, a low exhalation, something between a breath and a word in a language that did not use words. It moved forward until it stood beside Gandalf, its shoulder level with his, its pale eyes on the door. The chronicler looked at it with the complicated expression he had worn since it appeared. I knew it would come, he said. I told myself it would come. In the early years I believed it. Later I stopped believing and simply continued telling myself. He looked at Gandalf. What are you? Someone who followed it north, Gandalf said. Simply and completely true. The door opened when the Ivory Crown pressed its head against it. Not dramatically, not with light or sound or any theatrical acknowledgement of significance. The massive stone slab moved inward on whatever mechanism had held it for all these years with a grinding resistance that gradually gave way, the resistance of long stillness rather than the resistance of lock or bar, and beyond it the blue light that had been seeping through the walls intensified to something that was the source rather than a reflection of a source. The room beyond was circular and large, its ceiling domed, its walls entirely covered in the frost formations that resulted from very cold air meeting slightly less cold stone over a very long period, elaborate crystalline structures, branching and rebranching, covering every surface in white and pale blue, turning the room into something that was simultaneously architecture and weather. At the room's center, a figure. Seated on a low stone platform, cross-legged, hands resting on his knees in the posture of someone who had settled into a position and not moved from it for a very long time. He was tall, even seated, the length of his frame was apparent. His hair was white, long, spread across his shoulders. On his head, catching the blue light that suffused the room and returning it amplified, was the crown, not ice in the way that water froze into ice, but ice in the way that something fundamental and cold had taken a permanent form, its structure too complex and too deliberate to be anything other than intentional, its tines rising above his head in an architecture that was almost an echo of another crown that stood in the doorway behind Gandalf. He was not frozen. His chest moved, his eyes were open. He looked at Gandalf with eyes that had the particular quality of someone who has been alone with their own thoughts for so long that the arrival of another consciousness in the room was almost physically disorienting. Then he looked past Gandalf and his expression changed. He looked at the ivory crown for a long time without speaking. "I thought you would not come," he said at last. His voice was low and even, the voice of someone who had maintained control of it through deliberate practice. "I thought I had, that what I did had placed me beyond your coming." The ivory crown stood in the doorway and looked at him and did not move. "I did not want them to die," the prince said. The explanation of someone who had been composing it for decades, who had refined it down to its essential components, who knew that its essential components were both true and insufficient. "The cold was coming regardless. I did not cause it. I found it and I used it and I kept them from the end that was coming." He looked at his hands on his knees. "It has cost more than I understood it would cost. I understand that. I have had adequate time to understand it." "The Pale Hunters," Gandalf said, "the Ice Priests, the farmsteads to the south." Something moved in the prince's expression. "The cold extends. It always extends. It is the nature of cold to extend. I direct it as much as I can. I have been less precise than I was. There are limits to what sustained attention over this duration can maintain." A pause. "I did not intend the southern farmsteads." "And yet," Gandalf said, "and yet." He looked at the ivory crown again. "You have brought a judgment." The ivory crown stepped into the room. Its antlers caught the blue light and scattered it across the frost-covered walls in branching patterns that moved as it moved, the shadows of its tines reaching across every surface simultaneously. It walked to the center of the room, to the edge of the stone platform, and stood before the prince and looked at him from a distance of perhaps 4 feet with those pale, ancient, patient eyes. The prince looked back at it. Something was happening in his face, a dissolution of the long composure, slow and irreversible, the way ice eventually dissolved when the temperature finally changed. Not dramatic, not sudden, simply the end of something that had been held in place by will alone, and the will finally, after everything, letting go. "I am so tired," he said quietly. The ivory crown lowered its great head until its antlers nearly touched the floor in a gesture that was not submission and not dominance, but something that had no name in any political vocabulary, an acknowledgement perhaps of the full weight of what had been carried and how long it had been carried and what it had cost. The blue light in the walls began very slowly to change. Gandalf stood at the edge of the room and watched and did not intervene. This was not his to intervene in. This was older than him and larger than him and had been moving toward this moment since long before he had arrived in Grimholt, with cold in his cloak and a thread of instinct pulling him north. The pulse in the walls continued. For now, the blue light changed slowly, the way dawn changed the sky. Not all at once, not with any single moment that could be identified as the turning point, but through a gradual shift in quality that became undeniable only after it had already been happening for some time. The cold blue saturating the room's frost-covered walls began moving toward something fractionally warmer, the way a color shifts at the edge of a spectrum when you are not watching it directly. Not warm. Nothing in this room was going to become warm quickly, but different. The absolute zero intention of the pulse modifying itself at the source, because the source was modifying itself. The Prince of Winter had not moved from his platform, but his hands had changed position, no longer flat on his knees in the practiced stillness of decades of sustained concentration, but turned slightly upward, fingers open, the posture of someone who had stopped holding on. Gandalf watched from the doorway and said nothing. The ivory crown stood before the prince with its head still lowered, its antlers spread in long branching shadows across the floor. Its breath came slowly and steadily, each exhalation rising and dispersing in the cold air, and the prince watched the breath rise with the expression of someone watching something ordinary happen after a very long time in a place where nothing ordinary had been permitted to occur, something as simple as breath, something as unremarkable as the air moving in and out of a living thing. He watched it as though it was the most remarkable thing he had seen in decades, which it probably was. The hunters, the prince said, the ice priests, they will not understand what is happening. They have served this cold for a very long time. What they know as absolute. When they feel the pulse change, they will interpret it as an attack. He looked at Gandalf. They will respond accordingly. They have been responding since the road north of Grimholt, Gandalf said. The prince accepted this without visible reaction. The people above, when the pulse changes, they will begin to return. It will take time, and during that time they will be between, neither what they have been nor what they were, vulnerable in a way that what they have been was not vulnerable. How much time? I don't know. The honesty of it was clean and complete. The honesty of someone who had spent long enough with uncertainty to have stopped finding it shameful. I built this in desperation, with knowledge I had found rather than been given. I understood enough to make it work. I did not understand enough to know precisely how it would come undone. The chronicler appeared in the doorway behind Gandalf, having followed them from the corridor with the careful movement of someone whose legs had spent too long in one position. He looked at the prince, at the white hair, the ice crown, the changed quality of the light, and his face moved through several expressions before settling on something that was not quite any of them. "Aldrich," he said. The prince looked at him. Something moved in his expression at the name, the movement of someone hearing their own name spoken by someone who knew them, after years of being nothing to anyone except a function, a source, a mechanism. "Edric," he said, "you look terrible." "I have been sitting outside your door for 40 years past counting," the chronicler said. "I am not certain you are positioned to make that assessment." They looked at each other across the room, across the decades, across everything that had happened between the last time they had spoken and this moment. The looking contained more than any exchange of words would have contained, and they both understood this and left it at that. The pulse changed again, perceptible now even to ordinary senses. A fractional lengthening of the interval between beats, the rhythm slowing the way a heart slowed when the emergency driving it was beginning to resolve. In the walls, the frost formations shivered with each pulse, some of the more elaborate crystalline structures detaching at their tips and falling in brief glittering cascades to the floor. From above, transmitted through stone, a sound reached them, faint, easily misinterpreted as structural settling, but Gandalf knew it. Voices, not words yet, nothing as resolved as words, but the raw material of voices, the sound of people returning to themselves from wherever they had been. The prince heard it too. His eyes moved to the ceiling. "It begins," he said quietly. "The hunters," Gandalf said. "I should go up. When I remove the crown, the connection dissolves from the extremities inward," the prince said. "The outermost elements lose their connection first. The priests will collapse. They are sustained by the cold more than they know. The hunters," he stopped. "The hunters were people. Some of them were my people, from the outer settlements, who came to the cold willingly because they believed in what it was doing. When the connection dissolves, they may remember who they were." A pause. "Some may not." Gandalf looked at the ivory crown. The great creature raised its head to its full height, its antlers rising until their tines nearly touched the domed ceiling, the shadows they cast branching across every surface simultaneously. It looked at Gandalf with those pale, ancient eyes that had been watching kingdoms rise and fall in this latitude since before this kingdom had been anything other than a handful of people trying to survive a hard winter. In that look was everything that needed to be communicated and nothing that needed to be said aloud. Gandalf nodded once and turned to go. "When it is done," he said from the doorway, "when the people have returned, what then? The North is still the North. The winters are still long. The conditions that produced the original crisis have not changed." The prince was quiet for a moment. "No," he said, "they have not changed." He looked at his open hands. "But there are things I know now that I did not know when I went below, about the deep cold, what it is and what it cannot be asked to do. The knowledge cost more than it should have." He looked at the ivory crown. "Perhaps it can be used differently, less absolutely, less alone." The ivory crown looked at him with the patience of something that had been waiting for this answer for longer than the question had technically existed. Gandalf went back up through the corridor, through the vault, up the long staircase, and out into the white forest where the cold blue light filtering through the trees was already fractionally less blue, shifting toward something that was not yet gray but was no longer absolute. The hunters were in the forest. He felt them before he saw them, the familiar quality of the silence around things trying to be silent. They came through the trees from 3 directions in the pale dawn light, their white cloaks merging with the frost-covered undergrowth, their bone weapons raised. He stopped in a small clearing and waited. The first hunter reached the clearing's edge and stopped, not with the trained stillness of before, with a different kind of stillness, the stillness of something losing the framework its stillness had been built on, the connection to the source weakening at the extremities first, exactly as the prince had described. The mask fell. It simply detached, the ice holding it, giving way, and dropped into the snow. The face beneath was young, a face that had been cold and still for a very long time, now moving through expressions it had not made in years, working through them in sequence, confusion first, then something that took longer to arrive and was harder to name but was recognizably human in a way the masked face had not been. The other hunters stopped at the clearing's edge as the first one had stopped. The weapons came down. Not all of them. Not immediately, and not without the kind of pain that crossed several of the visible faces as the cold that had been their foundation receded and left them standing in an ordinary winter morning with ordinary cold on their skin. But the weapons came down one by one, in the blue becoming gray light of a morning that was arriving without being stopped. Above the forest, above the city walls, the sky was changing color, not warm yet, not spring. The North was still the North, and the winter was still long, and none of the things that were true about this latitude had been altered by what had happened below the ice. But in the streets of the frozen city, in the spaces between the buildings where the stopped people stood in their stopped moments, something was moving that had not moved in decades. The smoke from the chimneys was beginning, slowly and hesitantly, as though relearning something it had once known completely, to rise. The man in the middle of the road was lowering his pointing hand. The woman beside him was finishing her sentence. Somewhere in the granary steps, a child was looking down at a carved figure in her hands with the fresh attention of someone seeing a familiar thing for the first time. And the dog against the wall was lifting its nose from under its tail, and the 3 men outside the smithy were hearing the end of the joke, and one of them was beginning to laugh. Gandalf stood at the edge of the city and watched the frozen moment complete itself, all across the streets and the squares and the narrow passages between buildings, all the interrupted lives resuming their interrupted business with the mild bewilderment of people who had experienced something they had no framework for and were setting it aside, for now, in favor of the more immediate question of what came next. He did not have an answer to that question. That answer belonged to the people finding it. He turned south. The long road home was waiting, and the cold was already, incrementally, beginning to recede. Behind him, from somewhere deep beneath the city, the pulse beat once more. And then, for the first time in a very long time, it did not beat again. He left the city at mid-morning, when the light had settled into the flat gray brightness that passed for full day in the far north in winter. Not warm, not shadowless, but sufficient. The kind of light that showed things as they were without enhancement or drama. By that light, the city looked different than it had on arrival, less absolute, less the monument to a single sustained intention, and more what it actually was, a northern city in winter, old and cold, and in considerable disrepair, full of people who had a great deal of work ahead of them and were only beginning to understand the full extent of it. The streets were loud in the way that streets were loud after long silence. Not with any particular sound, but with the general accumulation of ordinary noise, the noise of people moving and speaking and doing the unremarkable things that people did, each individual sound modest, and the collective of them, amounting to something that filled the spaces between buildings and rose above the rooftops, and was, after everything, simply the sound of a city being a city again. Gandalf walked through it toward the southern gate, and people moved around him with the distracted purposefulness of those who had somewhere to be and were only beginning to remember where that was. Some of them looked at him, most did not. He was a stranger in a gray cloak with a staff and a slightly scorched hat, and the city had more immediately pressing questions than the provenance of strangers. The Ivory Crown walked at his left shoulder. The city made way for it with the instinctive deference that large animals commanded in confined spaces, people pressing to the sides of the road as it passed, children stopping to stare with the uncomplicated attention of children who had not yet learned which things were supposed to be remarkable. One old woman, standing in a doorway with her arms folded and the expression of someone assessing a situation, watched the moose pass with a look that was not surprise, as though she had been expecting it, or as though the sight of it had opened a door in her memory to something she had known in a previous life and was only now being asked to recall. At the southern gate, the prince was waiting. He had come up from below while Gandalf was still in the city streets, and the transformation that the removal of the ice crown had produced was visible in the quality of his presence. Less absolute, less the emanation of a single sustained purpose, more simply a tall old man standing in a gate with cold on his face and a great deal of complicated feeling visible in his expression. He was taller than he had seemed in the underground room. Or perhaps he had seemed smaller there because of what surrounded him, and here in ordinary daylight he occupied his actual dimensions. He had the ice crown in his hands. He held it the way you held something that had been part of you for a very long time and was now separate, with the particular care of estrangement, handling it as an object rather than as an extension of yourself. He looked at Gandalf when he arrived at the gate. Then he looked at the Ivory Crown. "I thought about coming to find you," he said to the moose. His voice was still the low, controlled voice of the underground room, but something in it had loosened. "In the early years, I thought about simply stopping, coming up and going out and finding you and asking for something. Permission, perhaps. Absolution. I don't know precisely what." He looked at the crown in his hands. "I didn't. I told myself it was because stopping would have killed them. And that was true. But it was not the only reason." The Ivory Crown stood in the gate and looked at him steadily. "I was afraid," the prince said, with the simplicity of someone who had spent a very long time with the truth and had finally decided the truth was not going to become easier to say by being left unsaid any longer. "I was afraid you would not come, that I had done something that placed me permanently outside the kind of thing you represented, that the cold had made me into something that did not deserve." He stopped. "That is also true," he said after a moment. Whatever I deserve or do not deserve is a separate question from what needs to happen now. What needs to happen now, Gandalf said, is the South, the farmsteads, the settlements along the passes, the people who had nothing to do with any decision made in this city and have been living with the consequences of those decisions for decades. Yes, the prince said. He looked at the ice crown in his hands for a moment, then held it out toward the ivory crown, not as an offering, as a relinquishment, the gesture of someone returning something that had never truly belonged to them to whatever authority it did belong to. The ivory crown looked at the crown for a moment. Then it turned its head away, in the deliberate manner of a creature that understood the symbolism of what it was declining, and looked south. The prince lowered his hands. He looked at the crown he was holding for a moment longer, then set it on the ground at the base of the gate's stone arch. It sat there in the snow, catching the flat gray light, its structure beginning at the margins to lose the sharp definition that sustained cold had given it, the outermost tines rounding slightly, the deep blue beginning its long, slow migration toward clear. He straightened and looked south. "I will come," he said, "to the settlements, to whoever will hear me. It will not be sufficient. There is no sufficient for what has been done. But it is the direction of sufficient, which is the only direction available." They left the city together, the three of them, and took the road south toward the frozen river. The road that had been a processional road, and then a buried road, and then a road again by the simple fact of being walked on by things that knew where it was. The marker stones passed at their intervals, each one bearing its name or its date in the old script, the chronicle of a kingdom that had not ended after all, or had ended and begun again in a form that would take time to understand and longer to name. The prince walked without speaking for a long time. Gandalf did not press him toward speech. The ivory crown moved ahead of them both, its pace steady, its breath rising in regular clouds, its antlers catching what light there was and distributing it in the peripheral way of things that carried light without being its source. Somewhere behind them, in the city they were leaving, the ordinary noise of people doing ordinary things continued its patient accumulation. The smoke from the chimneys rose. The children who had been frozen mid-gesture were doing other things now, new things, the continuations of lives that had been interrupted and were resuming with the mild bewilderment of all interrupted things. The chronicler was in his house, Gandalf suspected, sitting at his desk with a new volume open in front of him and his small, precise handwriting moving across the first page of whatever came next. The frozen river appeared below the ridge as they descended, its surface the same gray-white as before, the far bank the same dark line against the pale landscape. But the quality of the crossing was different this time. No shapes visible through the ice, or if they were there, they were less present, receding toward whatever resolution the deep cold had held them from for so long. The ice itself seemed fractionally less opaque, as though the transparency that had preserved was beginning to give way to the transparency that simply let light through. The ivory crown crossed first, as it always did. Gandalf followed, and the prince followed Gandalf, and none of them spoke until they reached the far bank and stood looking back at the river and the walls beyond it and the towers rising against the gray sky. It was a kingdom, the prince said quietly. Not with pride, with the plainness of fact. Before everything else, it was a kingdom. People lived in it and built things in it, and argued about ordinary things, and cooked food, and had children, and were cold in winter and less cold in summer, and complained about both. He looked at the towers for a moment longer. I wanted to preserve that. I preserved the wrong part of it. You preserved the part that can still become the rest of it, Gandalf said. The prince looked at him. The people are alive, Gandalf said, confused and cold and facing a very difficult several years, but alive. The knowledge of how to build and plant and trade is alive in them. The memory of what the city was is alive. The chronicler is alive and already writing. He paused. The wrong part, as you say, but not nothing. The prince was quiet for a moment. Then he turned south, toward the long road and the settlements waiting at its end and the conversations that would be harder than anything that had happened underground. The Ivory Crown was already moving, steady and unhurried, following the road as the road followed the landscape, as the landscape followed the logic of the north, patient and cold and capable, in its own time and on its own terms, of something that was not warmth exactly, but was the precondition of warmth. They followed it south into the long white afternoon. The settlement of Harrow lay at the end of a road that had not been a road for very long. A track, really, beaten into the snow by the passage of feet and animals over the course of a single hard winter, the kind of provisional path that became permanent only if the people making it survived to make it again the following year. On either side of the track, the evidence of recent work, cleared ground where the forest had been pushed back, the stumps of felled trees not yet rotted, a fence line that was more intention than accomplishment but was standing. The settlement itself was 7 buildings arranged around a central space that would become a square if the settlement lasted long enough to deserve one. It had been one of the first to be taken. Gandalf remembered it from the beginning of the journey north. The cold farmstead, the smoke that had not risen, the silence that had the wrong texture. He had stood at its edge and read what had happened and followed the thread of it north, and here, on the return, was the other end of that thread. The settlement was alive, not comfortably alive, not abundantly alive, but alive in the persistent way of things that had been interrupted and had resumed and were working through the resumption one task at a time. Smoke from 2 of the 7 buildings, footprints in the snow between the structures and patterns that indicated regular movement, the movement of daily routine reasserting itself, a dog barking somewhere behind the largest building, briefly and without alarm, the bark of a dog registering a new arrival rather than a threat. The people came out of their buildings with the careful curiosity of those who had learned to assess new arrivals before committing to a response. There were perhaps 30 of them, ranging from a white-haired woman who moved with the authority of someone who had organized the resumption of daily life and was not finished organizing it, to children who had none of the caution of the adults and came directly to the edge of the central space and stared at the Ivory Crown with the unguarded attention that children brought to remarkable things. The white-haired woman looked at Gandalf. Then she looked at the prince standing slightly behind him. Then she looked at the Ivory Crown for a long time. "I know what that is," she said. "Most people do not," Gandalf said. "My grandmother told me." She did not look away from the moose. She said, "If you ever saw it, the thing it was doing was more important than whatever you were doing, and you should pay attention." She paused. She also said it was very large. She was right about that. The Ivory Crown stood in the snow at the edge of the settlement and looked back at her with those pale, ancient eyes, and whatever passed between them in that looking was sufficient, because the woman nodded once and turned her attention to the prince. The conversation that followed was not easy. The prince spoke, and Gandalf did not speak for him, did not smooth the edges of what he was saying or translate it into anything more comfortable than it was. The people of Harrow listened with the particular quality of attention that people brought to explanations of things that had happened to them. Not the abstract attention of an audience hearing a story, but the close and personal attention of people checking what they were being told against what they already knew from the inside. Some of them were angry. The anger was clean and direct, and the prince did not deflect it. A man whose family had been in the farmstead to the east, the one that had not resumed, whose family had not come back when the pulse stopped, stood at the edge of the gathering and said nothing, and his silence was a different kind of statement than any of the words being spoken, and the prince looked at him directly and did not look away. "I cannot give back what was lost," the prince said. "I cannot make the time that was taken into time that was not taken. I can tell you what I know, and I can work toward what comes next, and I can tell you honestly that those 2 things are not equal to what was done, and I am not asking you to say that they are." The man at the edge of the gathering said nothing. He looked at the prince for a long time. Then he turned and walked back into his building, and the door closed behind him, and the gathering continued without him, and no one pretended that his leaving was not significant or that significance did not need to be carried. They stayed 2 nights at Harrow. On the first night, Gandalf sat by the fire in the largest building, while outside the temperature dropped to the deep cold of a northern night in midwinter, and the people of the settlement moved around him with the purposeful economy of people who had learned not to waste heat or light or time. The prince sat across the fire and spoke with the white-haired woman, whose name was Marit, and who was exactly what she appeared to be, the person who had organized the resumption and intended to continue organizing it, about the practical matters, about the spring, about what the land could produce in the first year after a long interruption and what it could not, about the settlements to the north that were resuming their own interrupted business and would need to re-establish the trade routes that had connected them before the cold came. The Ivory Crown did not come inside. It stood at the building's wall through the night, its bulk visible through the narrow window as a white mass against the dark, its breath rising in slow clouds that the light from the window briefly illuminated before the wind took them. On the second morning, a child brought it a handful of dried grass from the winter stores, holding it out with the seriousness of someone conducting an important transaction. The Ivory Crown lowered its enormous head and took the grass with a delicacy that the child found deeply satisfying, and the child went back inside to report this to anyone who would listen. They left on the third morning south again toward the lower settlements and the passes and the long road back toward country that had not spent decades under interrupted cold. The prince came as far as the track's edge with them and stopped there. "The settlements to the north need someone," he said, "someone who knows what happened and can speak to it directly, someone who knows the land." He looked at Gandalf. "I am not asking your permission." "You don't need it," Gandalf said. "No," the prince said, "I don't." He said it without defiance, with the simple acknowledgement of someone who had spent too long believing he needed permissions that were not anyone's to grant. He looked at the Ivory Crown. The great creature stood in the track and looked back at him for a long moment. Then it did something it had done only once before, in the underground room. It lowered its head slowly until the great spreading antlers came down toward the snow, not quite touching, held there for the space of several long breaths, not submission, not reverence exactly, something that recognized the full weight of what had been carried and the full difficulty of what had been set down and did not pretend either was a small thing. The prince stood very still while it happened. When the Ivory Crown raised its head again, the prince looked at it for a moment longer, and then he turned and walked back up the track toward Harrow, his figure diminishing against the white landscape until the track bent and the trees took him. The road south was long, and the days were short, and the cold was the ordinary cold of a northern winter, which was still considerable, but was the cold of weather rather than the cold of intention. And there was a difference that the body understood even when the mind was occupied with other things. The Ivory Crown set the pace, as it always had. On the third day, south of Harrow, the forest opened onto a ridge, and below the ridge a valley, and in the valley a river that was not frozen, running dark and quick between snow-covered banks, its sound reaching them on the ridge as a continuous low note, the note of water moving because water moved and winter had not stopped it and spring had not yet arrived, but the water was not waiting. Gandalf stopped on the ridge and looked at the running river for a long moment. The Ivory Crown stopped beside him, as it had stopped beside him on the ridge above the frozen river weeks ago, both of them looking at the same thing. Then it had been a kingdom of ice and stopped time and the question of what lay inside it. Now it was a valley in the ordinary grip of ordinary winter, and a river running because rivers ran, and the sound of it carried up to the ridge with the simple persistence of things that did not require permission to continue. The Ivory Crown breathed out slowly, a long white cloud that the wind took and dispersed. Then it began the descent toward the valley, steady and unhurried, following the road as the road followed the land, as the land followed whatever logic the North had been following since long before any kingdom had been built on it, or lost, or recovered, or had its smoke begin again to rise. Gandalf followed. The road went south, and the days, incrementally, were growing longer.